The stagecoach lurched violently, throwing Annie against the hard wooden side as another wheel found a rut in the endless prairie road. Dust swirled through the cracks in the windows, coating everything in a fine layer of grit that made her throat burn. She pressed her handkerchief to her mouth, trying not to cough, trying not to think about how far she'd come from home, or why. 3 weeks ago, she'd been Annie Whitfield, the plain eldest daughter who kept house while her beautiful sister Evelyn entertained suitors in the parlor. Now she was heading west under false pretenses, wearing Evelyn's name like an ill-fitting dress, to marry a man who thought he was getting someone else entirely. The letter crinkled in her pocket as she shifted on the hard bench. She'd read Jesse McCready's words so many times she could recite them. I am a man of simple means but honest intention. I have 160 acres of good land, a solid house, and need a wife of gentle disposition to share this life. He'd written to Evelyn, enchanted by the photograph their father had sent Evelyn with her golden curls and rosebud mouth, looking like an angel in her Sunday best. But Evelyn had wept and raged when the proposal arrived. She'd thrown the letter in the fire, declaring she'd rather die than live in some dusty wasteland with a stranger. Their father, deep in debt and desperate, had turned his eyes to Annie. You'll go in her place, he'd said, as if discussing the weather. He'll hardly notice the difference once you're there. The difference? Annie touched her face unconsciously, feeling the sharp angles where Evelyn had soft curves, the plain brown hair where Evelyn had gold. She'd tried to protest, but Father's hand had been heavy on her shoulder. You owe this family, girl, after all we've done for you. The coach hit another bump, and the woman across from her, a minister's wife heading to Colorado, clicked her tongue. These roads are a scandal, she declared. Back east, we'd never tolerate such conditions. Annie merely nodded, saving her voice. She'd learned over the past days that talking only made the dust worse. Besides, what would she say that she was a fraud, heading to deceive a good man who'd advertised for a wife in good faith? As the sun began its descent toward the horizon, painting the endless grassland in shades of amber and rust, the driver called out, Willow Creek Station ahead. Annie's heart hammered against her ribs. This was it, the end of the line, the beginning of her deception. The coach rolled to a stop beside a weather-beaten building that served as depot, general store, and post office. Annie climbed down on shaking legs, her traveling dress stiff with dust and sweat. The other passengers dispersed quickly, claimed by waiting relatives or hurrying to catch connecting coaches. Soon, she stood alone on the platform, a single carpetbag at her feet. The sun sat low now, casting long shadows across the dirt street. A few buildings lined what passed for the main thoroughfare, a saloon, a boarding house, what might have been a bank. Beyond them, the prairie stretched endlessly, broken only by the distant purple smudge of mountains. A figure emerged from the shadows beside the depot, tall, broad-shouldered, wearing work clothes and a wide-brimmed hat that obscured his features. He moved with the careful gait of a man who'd spent his life working the land, deliberate and sure. Miss Whitfield. His voice was deeper than she'd imagined, roughened by wind and weather. Annie forced herself to meet his eyes gray as winter sky, searching her face with an intensity that made her want to shrink away. Yes, she managed, the lie bitter on her tongue. He studied her for a long moment, and she saw the exact instant he realized something was wrong. His brow furrowed, eyes narrowing as they took in her plain features, her brown hair, her angular frame. This wasn't the golden angel from the photograph. I'm Annie, she said quickly, before she lost her nerve entirely. Sent in place of my sister. The words hung between them like dust motes in the fading light. Jesse McCready, for this had to be him, stood perfectly still, processing this information. Annie watched emotions flicker across his weathered face, confusion, disappointment, perhaps anger. Her fingers tightened on the handle of her carpetbag. I see, he said finally, voice carefully neutral. Annie lifted her chin, summoning what dignity she could. "If you wish to send me back, I understand. I have enough money for return fare." A lie she had $3 to her name. Jesse's jaw worked as if he were chewing over words. The silence stretched, broken only by the distant lowing of cattle and the creak of a sign in the evening breeze. Finally, he bent and picked up her carpetbag. "Come along." That was all. No welcome, no rejection, just those 2 words. Annie followed him to a wagon waiting in the gathering dusk. He helped her up to the seat with impersonal courtesy, his hands careful not to linger. As he climbed up beside her and took the reins, Annie caught his profile in the dying light, strong nose, firm mouth, a face carved by hardship and solitude. They rode in silence out of town, the wagon wheels creaking a lonely rhythm. The landscape opened around them, vast and foreign under the emerging stars. Annie had never seen so much sky, never felt so small. Back home in Ohio, there were always trees, always fences, always the comfortable press of civilization. Here, there was only space and wind and the unknown stretching ahead. Jesse handled the team with quiet competence, navigating by landmarks invisible to her in the darkness. Once, a coyote called from somewhere out in the black, and Annie shivered despite the lingering warmth of the day. "Cold?" Jesse asked, the first word he'd spoken since town. "No, just different." He made a sound that might have been understanding. "It takes getting used to." They lapsed back into silence. Annie wanted to explain, to apologize, to make him understand she hadn't chosen this deception, but the words tangled in her throat. What could she say that would make it right? The moon had risen by the time they turned down a rutted track. In its silver light, Annie could make out the shape of buildings, a house, a barn, what might be a chicken coop. The house was modest but solid-looking, with a covered porch and real glass windows that caught the moonlight. Jesse pulled the wagon up beside the porch and climbed down. He came around to her side, offering his hand. Annie took it, noting the calluses, the strength carefully controlled. Her feet touched ground that would be her home now if he let her stay. He carried her bag up the steps and through the door, lighting a lamp that cast warm light over a simple but clean interior. A main room with a fireplace, a table and chairs, a doorway leading to what must be a kitchen. Stairs led up to a second floor. "Your room's upstairs," he said, starting up. "First door." Annie followed, memorizing the creak of the third step, the way the banister had been worn smooth by years of use. Jessie set her bag inside a small but neat bedroom, a bed with a quilt, a washstand, a window looking out over the prairie. "Pumps in the kitchen if you need water, privy's out back." He paused in the doorway, not quite looking at her. "Breakfast is at dawn." Then he was gone, his footsteps retreating down the stairs and out the front door. Annie heard another door close somewhere, the barn, perhaps, or a lean-to. She stood alone in the lamplight, still wearing her travel-stained dress, still covered in the dust of 1,000 miles. She moved to the window and looked out at this strange new world. The land rolled away endlessly under the stars, beautiful and terrifying in its vastness. Somewhere out there, a night bird called, and the sound seemed to echo the loneliness in her chest. What had she done? What had been done to her? Annie unpinned her hair with shaking fingers, letting it fall around her shoulders. Tomorrow would bring questions, difficulties, the reality of this arrangement. Tomorrow, she'd have to face Jesse McCready again and somehow make a life with a man who'd wanted someone else entirely. But tonight, she was just Annie, not Evelyn. Not anybody's substitute, just a woman alone in a small room on the edge of forever, wondering if she'd ever feel like she belonged anywhere again. The rooster's crow pierced the pre-dawn darkness, jolting Annie from restless sleep. For a moment, she forgot where she was, reaching for the familiar comfort of her narrow bed back home. Then reality crashed over her like cold water, the strange room, the endless prairie outside her window, and Jesse McCready somewhere below. waiting for a breakfast she didn't know how to cook on a stove she'd never seen. She dressed quickly in her plainest work dress, pinning her hair back severely. No use pretending to be something she wasn't. In the kitchen, she found the stove already lit, coffee bubbling in a pot. Jessie must have started it before heading out to morning chores. Annie surveyed the supplies flour, lard, eggs gathered in a basket, salt pork in the larder. She could do this. Years of keeping house for her father and sister had taught her something, even if the kitchen was foreign territory. By the time Jessie's boots sounded on the porch, she had biscuits in the oven and eggs crackling in the skillet. He entered without knocking. This was his house, after all, and stopped short at the sight of her working at his stove. "Morning," he said, hanging his hat on a peg. "Good morning." Annie didn't turn from the eggs. "Coffee's ready." She heard him pour a cup, felt him watching as she moved about the kitchen. When she finally set the plate before him, eggs, biscuits, fried pork. He studied it like a man examining evidence. "Thank you," he said finally, picking up his fork. They ate in silence, Annie picking at her own breakfast. The biscuits were heavier than she'd intended. The eggs a touch overdone, but Jessie cleaned his plate without comment. When he finished, he pushed back from the table. "I'll show you the place," he said. "What needs doing?" It wasn't a question. Annie followed him outside into the cool morning air. The sun was just cresting the horizon, painting the grassland gold in daylight. She could see the full scope of the homestead, the barn with its attached corral, a hen house, a large garden plot already showing green shoots, a well with a wooden cover. "Chickens need feeding morning and evening," Jessie said, leading her to the hen house. "Gather eggs mid-morning when they're done laying. Garden needs water if it hasn't rained." He showed her the bucket and where to fill it, demonstrated the rhythm of drawing water from the well. His instructions were clear but clipped, delivered without warmth. He showed her the root cellar, the smokehouse, the spring house where milk and butter were kept cool. Each revelation brought new understanding of the work involved in maintaining even this modest homestead. "Washing's done Mondays," he continued. "There's a tub and board in the barn. Hattie Morrison, our neighbor to the south, she can show you the rest. Her place is 3 miles that way." He pointed across the prairie. "She'll likely come calling in a day or two." Annie nodded, trying to remember everything. Jessie paused at the garden gate, one hand on the rough wood. "Can you do this?" he asked, not looking at her. "The work?" "Yes." The word came out firmer than she felt. "I've kept house before. This isn't keeping house in town. It's different out here. Harder." Annie straightened her spine. "I'm not afraid of hard work." He turned then, really looking at her for the first time since her arrival. His gray eyes searched her face, looking for something weakness, perhaps, or dishonesty. Whatever he found seemed to satisfy him, for now. "I'll be working the south pasture today," he said. "Dinner's at noon. Supper when the sun touches the horizon." Then he was striding toward the barn, leaving Annie alone in the yard. She stood for a moment, overwhelmed by the list of tasks, the strangeness of it all. Then she squared her shoulders and headed for the hen house. The chickens scattered at her approach, squawking indignantly. Annie scattered grain as Jessie had shown her, talking softly to settle them. "Just you and me, ladies," she murmured. "We'll have to make the best of it." The morning flew by in a blur of unfamiliar tasks. Drawing water from the well left her arms aching. The garden was larger than any she'd tended. Rows of beans and corn and squash that seemed to stretch forever. She found a hoe and set to work on the weeds, sweat soon soaking through her dress despite the cool morning. When the sun climbed high, she retreated to the kitchen to prepare dinner. Salt pork again, boiled potatoes, the last of the morning's biscuits, plain fare, but filling. She was setting the table when movement outside caught her eye. A young man was talking to Jessie by the barn, gesturing animatedly, even from a distance. Annie could see Jessie's closed expression, Arms crossed over his chest. The younger man, barely more than a boy, really had sandy hair and an easy smile that reminded her painfully of the suitors who'd called on Evelyn. They came to the house together, Jesse's face unreadable. "This is Jonah Briggs," he said shortly. "Works the Morgan spread when they need extra hands. Jonah, my wife." The word wife sat strangely in the air. Jonah's eyes widened as he took in Annie's plain features, clearly trying to reconcile her with whatever Jesse had told him about his mail-order bride. "Pleased to meet you, ma'am," Jonah said, sweeping off his hat. His smile was genuine, warming. "Welcome to Willow Creek. Must be quite a change from back east." "Yes," Annie managed. "Quite a change. I was just telling Jesse. The Morgans are planning a barn dance come Saturday. Whole county'll be there. Be a good chance for folks to meet you proper." Jesse's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "We'll see." They ate dinner mostly in silence, though Jonah made a few attempts at conversation. He complimented the biscuits, asked about her journey, told a funny story about a runaway bull. Annie found herself almost smiling at his easy manner, so different from Jesse's granite reserve. When the meal ended, Jonah thanked her kindly and took his leave. Jesse walked him out, and Annie caught the low rumble of their voices through the window, though not the words. When Jesse returned, his face was darker than before. "The boy talks too much," he said, then headed back to work without another word. The afternoon stretched long and lonely. Annie attacked the house with desperate energy, sweeping, dusting, scrubbing the kitchen floor until her knees ached. Anything to keep busy. To stop thinking about the dance on Saturday. About meeting the whole county who would surely see through her deception immediately. As the sun began its descent, she started supper. She'd found dried beans soaking and set them to cook with a ham bone. Added cornbread to round out the meal. Simple food, but at least different from dinner. Jesse came in as shadows lengthened, bringing the smell of earth and sweat and horse. He washed at the pump, then took his seat at the table. Annie watched him from the corner of her eye as she served the meal, trying to read his mood in the set of his shoulders. "This is good," he said after the first bite of beans, the first compliment, if it could be called that. "Thank you." Annie sat across from him, the table between them like a chasm. "About the dance." "We don't have to go." "Don't we?" She met his eyes. "Won't people think it's strange if we don't?" Jesse set down his spoon. "People will think what they want regardless." "I'm not afraid of their opinions." "Aren't you?" His gaze was steady, seeing too much. "You're not what they expect. Neither of us is what the other expected." The truth of it hung between them. Annie looked down at her work-roughened hands. "No, we're not. But you're here," Jesse continued, voice quieter now. "And you worked hard today. I saw. It wasn't much, but it was something." Annie raised her eyes to find him still watching her, expression softer than she'd yet seen it. "This land," he said slowly, as if feeling for the right words. "It takes more than it gives, but when it gives, it's worth the keeping." Annie wasn't sure if he was talking about the land or something else entirely. Before she could respond, he'd pushed back from the table. "I'll be in the barn," he said. "Got tackle to mend." She cleaned up in silence, then stepped out onto the porch as full dark fell. The stars emerged one by one, more than she'd ever seen, scattered across the vast prairie sky like spilled sugar. Somewhere in the distance, coyotes called to each other, wild and free. Tomorrow would bring more work, more awkward silences, more of this strange dance between two people bound by necessity rather than choice. But tonight, Annie stood on the porch of a house that might become home, under stars that belonged to no one and everyone, and felt something she hadn't expected. Not happiness, not yet, but maybe, just maybe, the faint stirring of hope. The letters were hidden in a wooden box beneath his bed, tied with twine and smelling faintly of lavender Evelyn's signature scent. Annie found them while sweeping, 3 days after her arrival, and froze with the broom in her hand. She shouldn't look. They weren't meant for her eyes. But loneliness won over propriety. That evening, after Jesse retreated to the barn as had become his custom, Annie sat by lamplight and carefully untied the bundle. Her sister's handwriting stared back at her, all loops and flourishes, so different from Annie's practical script. The early letters were brief, polite responses to Jesse's advertisements, but as the correspondence progressed, his words revealed a depth that made Annie's chest tight. He wrote of sunrise over the prairie, of the satisfaction in coaxing life from stubborn soil, of winter nights when the wind sang lonely songs. He wrote of wanting someone to share the silence with, someone who could find beauty in simple things. "I am not a man of fancy words," one letter read, "but I promise honest work, faithful companionship, and a home built with these 2 hands. I hope for a wife who sees wealth not in gold, but in good earth and clear skies." Annie pressed the letter to her chest, eyes burning. This was the man who now barely spoke to her, who kept careful distance between them. Had he closed that tender heart when he realized the deception, or was it still there, buried beneath disappointment? Thunder rumbled in the distance, pulling her from her thoughts. Through the window, she saw lightning flash on the horizon. Jesse emerged from the barn, looking up at the darkening sky with the practiced eye of a farmer. He saw her watching and pointed to the west. "Storm coming," he called. "Need to get the stock secured." Annie didn't hesitate. She grabbed her shawl and hurried outside. The wind had picked up, whipping her skirts around her legs. Jesse was already moving toward the pasture where the cattle grazed. "The chickens," he said as she reached him. "Get them inside, then help me with the horses." They worked in urgent cooperation, the approaching storm erasing the awkwardness between them. Annie herded squawking chickens into their coop while Jesse drove the cattle toward the barn. Lightning cracked closer now, illuminating the prairie in stark flashes. "The horses are still in the far pasture," Jesse shouted over the rising wind. "There's a new calf out there, too, dropped this morning." Without thinking, Annie followed him into the darkness. Rain began to fall, fat drops that quickly became a deluge. They ran together across the uneven ground, Annie holding her skirts high, stumbling over prairie dog holes and tufts of grass. The horses were huddled against the fence, eyes rolling white with fear. But it was the calf Jesse went for, first a tiny thing, pressed against its mother's side. The cow bellowed in distress as Jesse approached. "Easy, girl," he soothed, but thunder crashed overhead, and the cow bolted. The calf, too young to follow quickly, stumbled and fell. Jesse scooped up the calf while Annie grabbed the rope he thrust at her. Together they herded the panicked animals toward shelter, rain streaming down their faces, turning the ground to mud. Annie slipped, going down hard on one knee, but scrambled up without complaint. Finally, blessedly, they reached the barn. Jesse carried the calf inside while Annie helped guide the horses into their stalls. The cow followed, lowing anxiously until reunited with her baby. They stood for a moment in the barn's relative quiet, both soaked to the skin, breathing hard. "You're bleeding," Jesse said. Annie looked down at her torn skirt, the scrape on her knee showing through. "It's nothing." "It's not nothing." His voice was gruff, but his hands were gentle as he guided her to sit on a hay bale. He knelt before her, examining the wound with careful fingers. "Needs cleaning." He fetched water and clean cloth from the tack room, then tended her knee with surprising tenderness. Annie watched his bent head, rain still dripping from his hair, and felt something shift in her chest. "Thank you," she whispered. He looked up, and for a moment, their eyes held. Lightning illuminated the barn, showing her the man who'd written those letters tender beneath the armor, lonely despite his strength. "Thank you," he said in return. "You didn't have to help." "Yes, I did." They stayed frozen for a heartbeat, his hand still on her knee, the storm raging outside. Then Jesse stood abruptly, stepping back. "We should get to the house. Get dry." They ran through the rain again, but this time Jesse kept hold of her arm, steadying her over the rough ground. Inside, he built up the fire while Annie lit lamps against the storm darkness. They stood dripping on the rag rug, suddenly awkward again. I'll go change," Annie said. "Wait." Jesse disappeared into his room, returning with a clean shirt and pants. "Your things'll be soaked through. These are dry." Annie took the clothes, touched by the gesture, when she came back down, swimming in his too large shirt. Jesse had coffee brewing and blankets warming by the fire. He'd changed too, hair still damp and curling slightly. They sat before the hearth, cups warming their hands, watching the fire dance. The storm continued its fury outside, but inside was warmth and quiet companionship. "My brother loved storms," Jesse said suddenly. "Thomas, he'd stand out in them, arms spread wide, laughing like a fool." A smile ghosted across his face, then faded. "Lost him at Antietam." Annie's throat tightened. "I'm sorry." "He was the one who should have had this place, better with people than me, better with everything." Jesse stared into the flames. He would have known what to say to a woman, how to be a proper husband. "You saved a calf tonight," Annie said softly. "Tended my knee. That seems proper enough to me." Jesse turned to look at her, firelight playing across his features. "Why did you come really?" Annie set down her cup, choosing honesty. "My father owed money. Evelyn is beautiful, she could marry well, save the family, but only if she stayed in society, where rich men could see her. She gestured at herself. "I'm nothing special, so I became the sacrifice." "You think you're nothing special?" The intensity in his voice made her look up. Jesse was studying her with that penetrating gaze, seeing past the plain features to something else. "I know what I am," Annie said simply. "I've always known. Evelyn got the beauty, the charm, the suitors. I got the cooking and cleaning and keeping quiet in the corner." "Your sister," Jesse said slowly. "She sent lavender-scented letters and a pretty picture, but tonight you ran into a storm to save animals that aren't even yours yet. You've worked from dawn to dusk without complaint. You've made this empty house feel—" He paused, searching for words. "Less empty." Annie's eyes burned with sudden tears. "Jesse?" "I won't lie," he continued. "When I saw you at the station, I was disappointed. I'd built up a dream in my head, foolish as that was, but maybe—" He rubbed his face. "Struggling. Maybe what a man dreams of and what he needs aren't always the same thing." Thunder crashed directly overhead, making them both jump. Then, impulsively, Annie reached out and took his hand. His fingers were calloused, strong, and after a moment's hesitation, they closed around hers. They sat that way as the storm spent itself, hands linked, watching the fire die to embers. No more words were needed. Outside, the rain gentled to a whisper, and somewhere in the barn, the rescued calf was safe with its mother when Annie finally rose to go to bed. Jesse stood too. For a moment they faced each other in the dim light, something new and fragile hanging between them. "Good night, Annie," he said, and her real name on his lips was better than any poetry. "Good night, Jesse." She climbed the stairs on unsteady legs, still feeling the warmth of his hand in hers. In her room, she carefully folded his borrowed clothes and placed them on the chair. Then she stood at the window, watching the last of the storm clouds scatter across the star-drunk sky. Below, she could see lamplight in the barn, Jesse checking on the animals once more, making sure all was well. A good man, a careful man, a man who wrote beautiful letters to a woman who'd never appreciated them. But Annie had read every word. treasured them like the gifts they were, and maybe, just maybe, that made all the difference. The drought arrived like an unwelcome guest, settling over the prairie with oppressive finality. 2 weeks after the storm, the last clouds disappeared beyond the horizon, leaving nothing but brass-bright sky and sun that baked the earth to hardpan. Annie watched the garden wilt despite her careful watering, saw Jesse's shoulders grow tighter with each rainless day. The creek that gave the town its name dwindled to a trickle every morning. Annie hauled bucket after bucket from the well, her arms screaming protest, sweat soaking through her dress before the sun fully rose. The vegetables drooped no matter how much water she gave them. The corn stalks rattled like old bones in the hot wind. Jesse worked from dawn to past dusk, digging irrigation ditches, trying to save what crops he could. He'd come in covered in dust, face drawn with exhaustion, and Annie would have water waiting, food that he barely tasted before falling into bed. Their newfound closeness from the storm night seemed to evaporate like morning dew, replaced by the grim determination of survival. It was on a particularly brutal afternoon that Hattie Morrison finally came calling. Annie was drawing water, struggling with the increasingly heavy bucket, when she spotted the buggy approaching across the shimmer of heat mirages. The woman who climbed down was everything Annie wasn't tall, confident, with steel-gray hair pinned severely back and keen eyes that missed nothing. She wore a practical brown dress and moved with the assured grace of someone who'd conquered this land and its hardships. "You must be the new Mrs. McCready," Hattie said, her voice carrying the authority of a schoolmarm. "I'm Hattie Morrison. Been meaning to come by sooner, but my well's been giving trouble too." Annie wiped her hands on her apron, conscious of her sweat-stained dress and disheveled appearance. "Please, come in out of the sun. I can offer you water, though not much else, I'm afraid." Hattie's sharp eyes softened slightly. "Water's gift enough these days, child?" Inside, Hattie settled at the kitchen table like she belonged there, watching Annie move about with those assessing eyes. Annie poured precious water from the pitcher, trying not to let her hands shake under the scrutiny. "Jesse said you were coming from back east," Hattie observed. "Ohio, was it?" "Yes, ma'am." "And how are you finding our prairie?" Annie chose honesty. "Harder than I expected, but I'm learning." Hattie nodded approvingly. "Good answer. The women who survive out here are the ones who admit what they don't know." She sipped her water thoughtfully. "Though I'll wager you didn't expect to be hauling water in a drought your first month." "No," Annie admitted. "Though I didn't expect much of anything, truth be told." Something in her tone must have revealed more than intended, because Hattie's expression sharpened. "Mail-order bride arrangements can be complicated," the older woman said carefully. "Jesse's a good man, though better than most. Lost his whole family in the war, came out here to start fresh. He deserves happiness." The unspoken question hung in the air. Could Annie provide that happiness before she could respond? Boots sounded on the porch. Jesse entered, stopping short at the sight of their visitor. "Hattie." He removed his hat, nodding politely. "Good to see you." "Jesse." Hattie's tone was fond but firm. "You look like death warmed over. When's the last time you ate a proper meal?" Jesse's eyes flicked to Annie, then away. "We're managing." "Managing?" Hattie snorted. "Well, I brought some preserves from last year. Figure you could use them." She produced several jars from her basket, the jewel-bright fruit a splash of color in the drought-dulled kitchen. Annie's throat tightened at the kindness. "Thank you. That's very generous." "It's what neighbors do." Hattie rose, smoothing her skirts. "Saturday's dance is still happening. Drought or no drought, folks need something to lift their spirits. I expect to see you both there." After she left, Jesse slumped into a chair, exhaustion written in every line of his body. Annie opened one of Hattie's jar's peaches, golden and perfect, and spooned some onto a plate with the last of the morning's bread. "Eat," she said simply, setting it before him, Jessie looked at the plate, then up at her. "You should save it. No telling how long." "Eat," Annie repeated, her tone brooking no argument. He ate, and she saw the moment the sweetness hit him, the way his eyes closed briefly in simple pleasure. It was such a small thing, but it felt like victory. Saturday arrived with no break in the heat. Annie wore her best dress, which wasn't saying much, and tried to tame her hair into something presentable. Jessie appeared in a clean shirt and pants, freshly shaved, looking uncomfortable but determined. "We don't have to go," he offered again as they climbed into the wagon. "Yes, we do," Annie replied. "Hattie expects us. Besides, I need to meet them all sometime." The barn at the Morgan spread was the largest building Annie had seen since arriving, festooned with lanterns and filled with people seeking respite from their daily struggles. Fiddle music spilled out into the evening air, mixing with laughter and conversation. The moment they entered, Annie felt the weight of curious stares. Conversations faltered as people took in Jessie McCready's new bride plane, angular, clearly not the golden beauty they'd been expecting. She heard whispers, caught fragments, not what I pictured. Poor Jessie. Bait and switch. Jessie's hand found the small of her back, warm and steadying. "Chin up," he murmured. "They'll gossip themselves out soon enough." But the whispers followed them through introductions, through the first dance that Jessie led her through with surprising grace. Annie fixed a smile on her face until her cheeks ached, answered the same questions over and over. Yes, from Ohio. Yes, quite a change. Yes, the drought was challenging. It was during a break in the music that she overheard the worst of it. She'd stepped outside for air and heard voices around the corner of the barn. "Feel sorry for him." A woman was saying, "Sending for a bride and getting—" "Well, you saw her. Plain as a fence post." Another agreed. "And that sister of hers, now there's a beauty, from what I heard. Can you imagine getting saddled with the wrong sister?" "Jessie's too polite to send her back. More's the pity. He deserves better after all he's been through." Annie stood frozen, each word a knife between her ribs. She knew she should move, should go back inside, but her feet seemed rooted to the dusty ground. "There you are." She spun to find Jessie behind her, his face unreadable in the lantern light. Had he heard his jaw was tight, eyes flinty as he looked toward the corner where the voices continued their cruel dissection. "Jessie!" But he was already moving, taking her arm and guiding her not back to the barn, but toward the wagon. "We're leaving. We can't just—" "Yes, we can." His voice was controlled fury. "I won't have them." He cut himself off, helping her up to the seat with hands that trembled slightly. They rode in silence until the lights of the dance faded behind them. Then Jessie pulled the horses to a stop, right there in the middle of the dark prairie. He sat for a moment, hands tight on the reins, before turning to her. "I'm sorry," he said roughly. "They had no right." They spoke the truth. Annie interrupted, surprised by her own calm. "I am plain. I'm not what you wanted, what you wrote to. I'm the wrong sister, the consolation prize, the—" "Stop!" The word cracked like a whip. Jessie turned fully to face her, and in the moonlight she could see the intensity in his eyes. "You think I care what they say? You think their opinion matters one whit to me? Doesn't it? They're your community, You've hauled water until your hands bled," Jessie said fiercely. "You've worked beside me without complaint. You ran into a storm for animals that weren't even yours. You—" His voice softened. "You make the house feel like a home." Annie's eyes burned. "Jessie!" "I won't pretend I wasn't disappointed at first," he continued. "But that was my failing, not yours. Building up a fantasy instead of seeing what was real. And what's real is worth more than any pretty picture." He picked up the reins again, clicking to the horses. They rode the rest of the way in silence. But it was a different silence than before. Warmer, fuller of possibility. Back at the house, Jesse helped her down from the wagon. His hands lingered at her waist, and they stood for a moment in the darkness, close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from his body. "They're wrong," he said quietly. "You're not second best. Not to me, not anymore." Then he was gone, leading the horses to the barn, leaving Annie standing in the dooryard with her heart hammering against her ribs. She pressed her hands to her burning cheeks, Jesse's words echoing in her mind. Maybe she wasn't beautiful. Maybe she wasn't what anyone would have chosen first. But standing there under the vast prairie sky, with the drought-dry wind whispering through the grass, and a good man's defense still warming her heart, Annie felt something she'd never expected. She felt valued. She felt seen. She felt like she might, just might, be enough. The letter arrived on a Tuesday, 3 months into the drought, when hope was as scarce as water. Annie recognized the handwriting immediately, those elaborate loops and flourishes that could only belong to Evelyn. Her hands trembled as she took it from the mail carrier, who'd made a special trip out from town. She waited until Jesse was in the far field before opening it, sitting on the porch steps with the envelope heavy as stone in her lap. The paper was thick, expensive, scented with that same lavender that clung to Jesse's hidden letters. "Dearest Annie," it began, though Evelyn had never called her dearest anything before. "I hope this letter finds you well in your rustic surroundings. Father tells me you've settled into your new life admirably, playing house with your farmer." Annie's jaw clenched at the condescension dripping from every word. She forced herself to continue. "I write with news that should please you. I am to be married to Mr. Cornelius Ashford of Boston. Perhaps you remember me mentioning him. His fortune in shipping is quite substantial. The wedding will be the event of the season." Of course, Evelyn had gotten exactly what she wanted, what she'd always been destined for. Annie waited for the sting of envy, but found only a hollow ache. "I confess, I've been curious about your situation." Father was rather vague in his letters. "Tell me, does he ever speak of what might have been had I come instead? I imagine it must be quite awkward, knowing you're living the life meant for me. But then, you always were good at accepting scraps from my table." Annie's hands shook now with anger rather than nerves. How dare Evelyn write such things? How dare she twist the knife when she'd been the one to refuse? To throw Jesse's heartfelt letters in the fire? The letter continued with descriptions of wedding preparations, of Cornelius's wealth, of the grand house they would inhabit. Each word was chosen to wound, to remind Annie of everything she would never have. It ended with mock sweetness. "Do give my regards to Mr. Macready. I hope he's not too disappointed with the exchange. After all, not every man can have what he truly wants. Some must settle for what's available." Annie crumpled the letter in her fist, then smoothed it out again. No, she would not let Evelyn have this power over her. She stood and walked deliberately to the kitchen stove, where the fire burned low despite the heat outside. They needed it for cooking. Without ceremony, she fed the letter to the flames, watching Evelyn's poisonous words turn to ash. But the damage was done. The doubts Evelyn had voiced were ones that already lived in Annie's heart, now given new life and vigor. Did Jesse think of Evelyn when he looked at her? Did he compare them and find her wanting? Was she truly just living a life meant for someone else? She moved through her chores mechanically that day, Evelyn's words echoing with each bucket of water drawn, each row of withering vegetables tended. By the time Jesse came in for supper, she could barely meet his eyes. He noticed, of course. Jesse noticed everything with those watchful gray eyes, though he didn't always speak of it. They ate in unusual silence, even for them. Finally, he set down his fork. "What's wrong?" "Nothing." The lie tasted bitter. Annie. Just her name, but weighted with concern. She stood abruptly, busying herself with clearing plates. "Just tired. The heat." Jesse caught her wrist gently as she reached for his plate. "What happened?" The tenderness in his voice nearly undid her. She pulled free, turning away. Nothing happened. Everything's fine. She heard his chair scrape back, felt him standing behind her. Not touching, but close enough that she could feel his presence like a physical thing. Did someone in town say something at the store? No. She gripped the edge of the wash basin. Just leave it be. Jesse, please. For a long moment, he stood there. Then she heard him move toward the door. I'll be fixing the fence in the north pasture if you need me, he said quietly, and was gone. Annie sank into a chair, pressing her palms against her burning eyes. She would not cry over Evelyn's cruelty. She would not. The day wore on, hot and endless. Annie threw herself into work, scrubbing floors that were already clean, mending clothes that barely needed it, anything to keep her hands and mind busy. But as evening approached and Jesse didn't return for supper, worry began to gnaw at her. She found him still at the fence, working by the last light of day. His shirt was soaked with sweat, his movements sharp with an agitation she'd rarely seen in him. Jesse, supper's ready. He didn't turn, not hungry. Annie studied his rigid back, the tension in his shoulders. What's wrong? He gave a short, bitter laugh. That's my line. They stood there in the gathering dusk, the broken fence between them like a metaphor too obvious to ignore. Finally, Annie's stubborn pride cracked. I had a letter, she said quietly. From Evelyn. Jesse's hands stilled on the fence post he was setting. I see. Do you... The words burst out of her. Do you see how she mocks me? How she reminds me I'm living a life meant for her? How she wonders if you speak of what might have been... Annie's voice broke on the last words. Jesse turned then, and the look on his face stopped her cold. Not disappointment or longing, but fury, pure, protective fury. What might have been? He strode toward her, stopping just short of touching. What might have been is I'd have married a woman who thought my letters were worth less than ash. Who saw this land, this life as beneath her? Who would have made me feel like I was never enough? Just like... He cut himself off, jaw clenched. Just like who? Annie asked softly. Jesse's shoulders slumped. My mother. She hated this life, hated what it did to my father. Spent her days wishing for something else, somewhere else. It poisoned everything. That wanting killed her as sure as any sickness. He moved past Annie to sit heavily on a fallen log. After a moment, she joined him, careful to leave space between them. I thought beauty would fill the silence. Jesse continued, voice rough. Thought if I found someone pretty enough, charming enough, it would make up for all the ways I'm lacking. But beauty without peace is nothing but noise. Annie thought of Evelyn's letter, the pretty words hiding ugly thoughts. She burned your letters, she said suddenly. The ones you sent, I saw her throw them in the fire without reading them. But I found the ones you'd written before sending. I read them. She risked a glance at his face. They were beautiful. Jesse, true and honest and beautiful. Jesse stared at her. You read them. Heat flooded her cheeks. I'm sorry. I shouldn't have... No. He reached out, covering her hand with his. No, I'm glad. At least someone appreciated them. They sat in the deepening darkness, hands linked, while night birds began their evening songs. Finally, Jesse spoke again. I was sent because no one else would go, Annie said, echoing her words from weeks ago. That's what you told me once. I remember. Well, I'm starting to think maybe I wasn't sent at all. Maybe I chose to come, even if I didn't know it then. Because Evelyn... Annie squeezed his hand. She never would have run into a storm with you. Never would have hauled water until her hands bled. Never would have seen the beauty in your letters or the worth in this land. Annie, you think I don't see, she continued, using his own words from that night by the fire. But I do. I see a man who works from dawn to dusk to build something lasting, who tends sick calves with gentle hands, who defended me to the gossips even though I'm not what you wanted. You are what I want. The words came out fierce, almost desperate. God help me, Annie, you are. Not because you're here, not because I'm settling, because you're you, because you see this life as something to build, not something to endure. Annie's eyes burned with tears she refused to shed. Jessie? He stood abruptly, pulling her up with him, and suddenly they were standing close, closer than they'd ever been. His free hand rose to cup her cheek, thumb brushing away a tear that had escaped despite her efforts. She can keep her Boston mansion, he said roughly, her shipping fortune and her society wedding, because I've got something worth more than all of that. What's that? Annie whispered. A woman who reads my letters and finds them beautiful, who works beside me without complaint, who makes this empty house into a home. His forehead rested against hers. I've got you, Annie, if you'll have me, really have me, not just the arrangement, but— Yes, the word came out sure and strong. Yes, Jessie. He kissed her then, there in the gathering darkness with the dry grass rustling around them and the first stars appearing overhead. It wasn't the stuff of fairy tales, they were both dusty and tired, standing by a half-mended fence in the middle of a drought. But it was real and true, and theirs. When they finally drew apart, Jessie kept her close, his arms strong and sure around her. Write your sister back, he said against her hair. Tell her thank you for refusing me, for sending you instead. Annie laughed, surprising herself with the sound. I burned her letter. Good. Jessie pulled back to look at her, a smile playing at the corners of his mouth. But if she writes again, you tell her Jessie McCready got exactly what he wanted, the only woman meant for him. They walked back to the house hand in hand, the weight of Evelyn's cruel words lifting from Annie's shoulders with each step. Behind them, the unmended fence stood as a reminder that some things were worth leaving broken, while others, the important things, were worth fighting to repair. The drought stretched on like a living thing, sucking moisture from earth and hope from hearts. By the 4th month, the creek was nothing but cracked mud and memory. The well dropped lower each day, forcing Annie to lower the bucket deeper into the earth's diminishing mercy. The vegetables she'd tended so carefully withered despite her efforts, leaves crisp as old paper. Jessie grew quieter with each rainless dawn, the weight of potential failure heavy on his shoulders. He'd already lost 2 calves, and the remaining cattle grew gaunt, ribs showing through their dusty hides. Annie watched him stand at the porch rail each morning, scanning the horizon for clouds that never came, and her heart ached for him. She did what she could. Water was rationed carefully cooking, drinking, and only the most essential washing. Her hands grew rough as bark from the constant work, nails cracked and bleeding. But she never complained. This was her life now, her land, her struggle alongside the man who'd claimed her heart completely that night by the broken fence. It was on a particularly brutal afternoon, the sun a merciless hammer in the bleached sky, that Annie made her usual trip to town for supplies. The general store was nearly empty, credit stretched thin for everyone, shelves showing gaps like missing teeth. She gathered what she could afford: flour, salt, a precious tin of coffee. Mrs. McCready. The voice was oily smooth, belonging to Carl Donovan, who owned the bank. How fortunate to find you here. Annie's stomach tightened. Donovan never spoke to her directly, preferring to whisper with other men while their wives looked down their noses at Jessie's plain bride. Mr. Donovan. She nodded politely, trying to move past him. I wonder if you might pass along a message to your husband. His smile was sharp as a blade. His note comes due next month, given the current difficulties. I do hope he's prepared to settle accounts. The blood drained from Annie's face. Note. Oh yes, the loan he took to buy seed and supplies this spring. Surely he mentioned it. Donovan's eyes glittered with false concern. These are trying times for everyone, of course, but business is business. Annie managed to keep her composure until she was out of the store, but her hands shook as she loaded the meager supplies into the wagon. Alone. Jessie had taken a loan, betting on a good harvest that the drought had stolen. How much, when was it due? Why hadn't he told her? The ride home seemed endless, her mind churning with worry. She found Jesse in the barn, trying to stretch their dwindling hay supply. He looked up as she entered, and his face changed immediately. What happened? Carl Donovan. Annie couldn't keep the accusation from her voice. He mentioned a note coming due. Jesse's face went carefully blank. I see. Do you? Because I don't. When were you planning to tell me we might lose everything? We're not going to lose. Don't! Annie's voice cracked. Don't lie to me. Jesse, not now. Not after everything. He set down the pitchfork, shoulders slumping. $500. Due in 6 weeks. The sum hit her like a physical blow. It might as well have been $5,000 for all the chance they had of raising it. I took it before you came. Jesse continued quietly. Thought with a good harvest. Maybe a wife to help with the garden. We could expand, make a real go of it. Then the drought. He gestured helplessly. Annie sank onto a hay bale, anger draining away to leave only fear. What happens if we can't pay? Donovan takes the land. It's what he's always wanted, to add my acres to his son's spread. Jesse's laugh was bitter. Probably celebrating the drought like it's Christmas morning. They stood in the dusty barn, the weight of impending loss heavy between them. Then Annie straightened, chin lifting with determination. No. Jesse looked at her. No. No, we're not giving up. There has to be something. The cattle. Could we sell them? Not enough. Not with beef prices what they are. And the horses. Need them for plowing, if rain ever comes again. Annie paced, mind racing. What about a payment plan part now, the rest after harvest? Donovan won't agree. He wants the land. Then we'll find another way. Annie turned to face him, fierce with determination. This is our home. Jesse, our life. I won't let them take it without a fight. Something shifted in Jesse's expression, surprise, perhaps, or admiration. Our home. Yes, she stepped closer, taking his hands. I know I came here as a stranger, a replacement, a last resort. But this is my home now. You're my husband, and I'll be damned if I let Carl Donovan or anyone else take that from us. Jesse pulled her close, burying his face in her hair. I should have told you. I wanted to protect you from it. We protect each other, Annie said firmly. That's what marriage means. The next days passed in a blur of desperate calculation. Annie went through everything they owned, looking for anything of value. Her mother's silver comb worth perhaps $20. Jesse's father's pocket watch another $30. Drop by drop, but nowhere near an ocean. It was Hattie Morrison who provided the first real hope. She arrived one morning with her usual practical manner, but also with news. There's talk of a horse race, she said over coffee. Big one, over in Cedar Falls. Prize money's considerable, near $1,000. Jesse shook his head. I don't have a racing horse. Hattie, don't you? Hattie's eyes were sharp. That mare of yours, the gray I've seen her run when she's got a mind to, like wind over grass. Annie looked at Jesse. She'd seen the mare too. Moonlight, he called her, a beautiful animal with legs built for speed, though Jesse used her mainly for regular riding. It's a risk, Jesse said slowly. Entry fee's $50. If we lose, we're no worse off than now, Annie pointed out. But if we win... The race was set for 2 weeks hence. Jesse began training with Moonlight, while Annie took over more of the farm work. She watched them in the evenings, horse and rider moving as one across the prairie, and allowed herself to hope. But hope was hard to maintain as the drought continued its stranglehold. More neighbors gave up, loading their few possessions and heading back east or further west. Anywhere but here. The Smiths, whose farm bordered theirs to the north. The Youngs, with their 3 small children. Each departure felt like another nail in the coffin of the community. Then came the whispers in town. Annie tried to ignore them at first, but they grew louder with each trip for supplies. Desperate times. Mrs., Donovan said loudly as Annie passed. Some people will try anything to avoid their obligations. Indeed, her companion replied. Though I suppose when you've already deceived a man into marriage, what's a little more dishonesty? Annie's hands clenched, but she forced herself to walk on. They didn't matter. Only Jesse mattered. Only keeping their land. That night, she found Jesse standing by the corral, watching moonlight graze in the fading light. They're saying I trapped you, Annie said quietly. That I knew about the debt and came anyway, looking for a fool to save me from spinsterhood. Jesse turned, and the look in his eyes made her breath catch. Let them talk, he said. They don't know you, don't know what you've sacrificed, what you've built here. He cupped her face in his hands. I wasn't trapped, Annie. I was saved from a lifetime of empty beauty, of wanting what could never satisfy. You're the best thing that ever happened to me, drought and debt and all. She kissed him then, pouring all her love and determination into it. When they broke apart, both breathing hard, she managed a smile. Then let's save this farm. Jesse McCready. Together. Together, he agreed. And in that moment, despite the drought and the gossip and the looming threat of loss, Annie felt richer than her sister with all her Boston finery could ever be. The race was coming, their last chance approaching like a storm on the horizon. And Annie knew, win or lose, she and Jesse would face it as they'd learned to face everything side by side, honest and true, with hearts as vast and enduring as the prairie itself. The morning of the race dawned clear and merciless, another brass-bright day in the endless drought. Annie had barely slept, lying beside Jesse and feeling the tension in his body, both of them pretending to rest while their minds raced with possibility and fear. They rose before dawn, moving through their preparations with the gravity of ritual. Jesse had already left for Cedar Falls with moonlight when the buggy rolled up to their door. Annie, dressed in her best worn dress and preparing to follow on their old mare, froze at the sight of the elegant conveyance. Her heart plummeted as a figure in traveling silk emerged. Evelyn. She stood in their dusty yard like a butterfly among corn husks, golden curls perfectly arranged despite the journey, blue eyes taking in the modest homestead with barely concealed disdain. Behind her, a well-dressed man remained in the buggy Cornelius, no doubt, come to witness his bride's final victory over her plain sister. Annie. Evelyn's voice dripped honey over poison. My goodness, you look, well, considering. Annie straightened her spine. Evelyn, this is unexpected. Is it? Evelyn smoothed her skirts, each gesture calculated to emphasize the difference between them. When Father wrote about your difficulties, I simply had to come. Family should support each other in times of trial, don't you think? The words were kind. The tone was anything but. Annie felt the old familiar pain, the sense of being lesser, but now it was overlaid with something new, protective fury. This was her home Evelyn was disparaging with every glance. How thoughtful, Annie managed. But as you can see, we're managing fine. Are you? Evelyn drifted closer, and Annie caught that familiar lavender scent. Father mentioned something about a race today. How desperately romantic betting your entire future on a horse. Though I suppose desperate is the word, isn't it? What do you want? Evelyn. Her sister's beautiful face shifted, the mask slipping to reveal something harder beneath. I want to help. Of course, Cornelius and I have discussed it, and we're prepared to offer you a position. You'd make an excellent lady's maid. I've always said you had a talent for keeping house. The offer hit Annie like a slap. To serve her sister, To spend her days tending the woman who'd taken everything and given nothing? Or, Evelyn continued, examining her perfect nails, we could help with your debt situation. Cornelius has connections. For the right price, of course. What price? Evelyn's smile was sharp as winter ice. Oh, nothing much, just an annulment. After all, this marriage was made under false pretenses. Wasn't it you pretending to be me? I'm sure any judge would understand. Then Jessie would be free to find a more suitable wife. The words hung in the morning air like smoke from a distant fire. Annie stared at her sister, finally understanding the depth of Evelyn's cruelty. It wasn't enough that she'd refused Jessie, rejected his honest heart for gold and glamour. She needed to prove that Annie couldn't have him either, couldn't succeed where the beautiful Evelyn had chosen not to try. No. Evelyn blinked. I beg your pardon. No. Annie stepped forward, and, for once, her plain features were an advantage. There was nothing soft to hide the steel underneath. I won't be your maid. I won't take your money. And I certainly won't give up my husband to soothe your vanity. Vanity? Evelyn's voice rose. You think this is about vanity? I know it is. Annie met her sister's gaze steadily. You can't bear that someone wanted me for myself. That Jessie chose me. Not because he had to, not because I was all that was left, but because I'm the woman who works beside him, who shares his dreams, who sees wealth in good earth and honest work. He settled for you. He chose me. Annie's voice rang with certainty. Just as I chose him. And nothing you say, nothing you offer, will change that. Evelyn's perfect features contorted with rage. You stupid, stubborn! Do you have any idea what you're throwing away? Security, comfort, a chance at a real life? I have a real life. Annie gestured at the homestead. The garden she'd coaxed from stubborn soil. The house she'd made into a home. It may not be fancy enough for you, but it's mine, ours, built with our own hands and honest work. Built on sand, Evelyn snapped. When you lose that race, and you will when the bank takes everything, where will your precious choice be? Then Jessie will hate you for dragging him down, for being the millstone around his neck. Mark my words, Annie. He'll look at you one day and see nothing but the shadow of what he could have had. The words found their mark, lodging like arrows in Annie's heart. But she'd learned strength these past months, learned that some things were worth fighting for even when you were afraid. Maybe, she said quietly, but I'd rather fail beside Jessie than succeed as your servant. Now get off our land. Evelyn drew back as if slapped. How dare you! This is my home. Annie stepped forward again, and Evelyn actually retreated. You're not welcome here, not with your poison disguised as help, not with your cruelty wrapped in silk. Go back to Boston, Evelyn. Marry your merchant, live your life, but leave us to live ours. For a moment, they stood frozen, sisters who might have been strangers for all they understood each other. Then Evelyn laughed, high and brittle. At last I've come, she said, and Annie recognized the words from a rehearsed speech, the one she'd probably practiced in the mirror. At last I've come to see what my life might have been. And do you know what I see? She gestured dismissively at the homestead. Dust and poverty and a woman aging before her time. Thank God I had the sense to refuse. She turned with a swirl of silk, but paused at the buggy step. Surely you never meant to settle for less, she said, not turning back. That's what I would have said to him. You know, if he'd been worth my time. Surely a man like Jessie McCready never meant to settle for less than he deserved. You're right, Annie said clearly. He didn't settle for less. He waited for more. More courage, more strength, more heart than you could ever understand. Let her go, Cornelius. She called to the man in the buggy. Let her go back to the life she chose. We have a race to win. Evelyn climbed into the buggy without another word, but her face through the window was a mask of fury, and something else perhaps, just perhaps, the faintest shadow of doubt. As they rolled away, dust rising behind their wheels, Annie allowed herself one moment of weakness, pressing her hand to her chest where her sister's words had lodged like splinters. Then she straightened, gathered her worn skirts, and mounted the old mare. Cedar Falls was waiting. Jessie was waiting, their future balanced on the knife's edge of hope and determination. The race grounds were packed when she arrived. Farmers and townspeople gathered despite the hard times, desperate for distraction from the drought's relentless grip. Annie pushed through the crowd, searching for Jesse, and found him by the starting line with Moonlight. His face changed when he saw her. "Annie, what's wrong?" She must have looked worse than she thought, still shaken from Evelyn's visit. "Nothing. Everything's fine." But Jesse knew her too well now. He handed Moonlight's reins to Jonah Briggs and drew Annie aside. "Tell me." So she did, the words tumbling out Evelyn's arrival, her offer, her threats. Jesse's face darkened with each word, his hands clenching at his sides. "She said I'd drag you down," Annie finished, "that you'd grow to hate me for it." "Annie." Jesse gripped her shoulders, forcing her to meet his eyes. "Look at me. Really look." She did, seeing past her fears to the truth in his weather-beaten face, the honesty that had first drawn her to his letters. "You could never drag me down," he said fiercely. "You lift me up, every day, every moment. Your sister offered you escape, and you chose to stay. You chose us. How could I hate the woman who fights beside me, who makes me better than I ever thought I could be?" "Jesse." "I mean it." His hands gentled on her shoulders. "Win or lose today, we face it together. That's what she'll never understand. It's not about settling. It's about choosing, and I choose you. Annie McCready, today, tomorrow, always." A bell rang, calling riders to their mounts. Jessie pressed a quick kiss to her forehead. "Watch for us at the finish line." Annie found a spot where she could see, her heart hammering as Jessie swung up onto Moonlight. The gray mare danced sideways, sensing the excitement, her coat gleaming like her namesake in the harsh sun. Other horses lined up expensive thoroughbreds, seasoned racers with wealthy owners who could afford to lose. The starting gun cracked. They flew forward in a thunder of hooves, dust rising in great clouds. Annie lost sight of Jessie in the melee, could only pray as the pack swept around the first turn. The course was brutal, 1.5 miles over rough ground, testing endurance as much as speed. She saw him emerge from the dust in 4th place, Moonlight's stride steady and strong. "Come on," Annie whispered, hands clenched so tight her nails bit into her palms. "Come on." Second turn. Jessie had moved up to 3rd, Moonlight finding her rhythm, but the leaders were pulling away, their expensive bloodlines showing. Annie's heart sank. It wasn't enough. They tried, but... Then she saw Jesse lean forward, his lips moving near Moonlight's ear. Whatever he said, the mare's ears flicked back, and suddenly she surged forward like gray lightning, past the 3rd-place horse, gaining on 2nd. The crowd roared as they entered the final stretch. The leader, a bay stallion owned by none other than Carl Donovan's son, was still ahead by 2 lengths. 1 length, Moonlight stretched out, Jessie low over her neck, the two moving as one being bent on flight. They crossed the line together, so close Annie couldn't tell who'd won. The crowd erupted in chaos, arguments breaking out over the results. Officials huddled, comparing notes. Annie pushed through the mass of people, desperate to reach Jesse. She found him walking Moonlight, cool, the mare's sides heaving but her head high with pride. "Jesse?" He turned, and his smile was answer enough. "By a nose," he said. "We won by a nose." Annie threw herself at him, not caring who saw, and he caught her up in a fierce embrace. Around them, people cheered or grumbled depending on their bets. But Annie heard none of it. There was only Jessie, only the miracle of this moment. She was wrong. Jessie murmured in her ear, "Your sister. She said I'd settled for less. But she had it backward. I reached for more than I deserved and somehow caught it. Through her tears, Annie saw Carl Donovan's furious face as he pushed through the crowd, saw the race officials counting out the prize money, saw their neighbors, even the gossips, nodding with newfound respect. But most of all, she saw Jessie, dusty and tired in hers. "We did it," she breathed. "No," Jessie corrected, setting her back just enough to meet her eyes. "You did it. You never gave up. Not on the farm. Not on us. You're the strongest woman I know. Annie McCready," standing there in the dust and noise of the race grounds, holding tight to the man who'd become her whole world. Annie finally understood something. She hadn't been sent here as a replacement or a consolation prize. She'd been led here, meant to be seen, meant to be loved, meant to be chosen forever. And as Jessie kissed her there in front of God and everyone, Annie knew that Evelyn, for all her beauty and silk dresses, would never have anything as precious as this, a love earned through struggle, strengthened by hardship, and worth more than all the gold in Boston. They'd won more than a race today. They'd won their future together. The sun was setting as Evelyn's buggy pulled away, leaving a cloud of dust that seemed to shimmer with the ghosts of what might have been. Annie stood on the porch, one hand pressed to her heart, watching her sister disappear into the prairie distance. The race winnings were safely deposited, the farm saved. But Evelyn's visit had left wounds that mere money couldn't heal. Jessie found her there as darkness gathered, bringing with him the ledgers showing their debts cleared and enough left over for seed come spring. He set it aside without a word, coming to stand beside her at the rail. "She's gone," Annie said unnecessarily. "Good riddance." Jessie's voice was hard. "Anyone who can't see your worth doesn't deserve your time." Annie turned to study his profile in the dying light. The past months had carved new lines around his eyes, the drought and worry aging them both. But there was peace in his face now, a settling that hadn't been there before. "I used to dream about being her," Annie admitted quietly. Beautiful Evelyn with her golden hair and graceful ways. I'd stand before the mirror trying to imitate how she walked, how she smiled. She laughed, but it was edged with old pain. I'd have given anything to be the sister men wrote poetry about. Jessie was quiet for a long moment. Then, "I wrote poetry once." Annie looked at him in surprise. "You did?" A faint smile touched his lips. "Terrible stuff. Comparing eyes to summer skies, hair to fields of wheat, the kind of nonsense young men write when they don't know any better." He turned to face her fully. "But you know what I'd write now." "What?" He reached out, taking her work-roughened hands in his. "I'd write about hands that haul water until they bleed but never let go of the bucket, about eyes that see straight through to the truth of things, about a heart brave enough to choose love over comfort, strong enough to stand when others would run." "Jessie." Annie's throat was tight. "I'd write about the woman who ran into a storm with me," he continued, voice deepening with emotion, who faced down gossips and drought and her own sister's cruelty without flinching, who made this empty house into a home just by being in it. He pulled her closer, one hand rising to cup her cheek. "She can keep her Boston mansion, her silk dresses, her easy life, because I've got something worth more than all of that." "What's that?" Annie whispered, echoing their conversation from months ago. "A partner, an equal, the only woman meant for me." His forehead touched hers. "I never chose wrong, Annie. I chose forever, though I didn't know it then." Tears slipped down Annie's cheeks, but they were tears of joy, of release, of finally believing what her heart had been trying to tell her. "I love you, Jessie McCready." "And I love you, Annie McCready. Not despite anything, not compared to anyone. Just you, exactly as you are." They kissed there on the porch, the vast prairie spreading around them under the first stars. When they finally drew apart, Annie felt something fundamental shift inside her, the last walls of doubt crumbling, leaving only truth. "Come inside." Jessie said, "I have something to show you." In their bedroom now. Truly, he pulled out a wooden box from beneath the bed. Not the one with Evelyn's letters, but another, older and more worn. Inside were pages covered in his careful script. "My attempts at poetry," he said, almost shy. "And other things, thoughts about this land, this life, dreams I had before." He gestured helplessly. "I stopped writing when Martha died. My first wife. Couldn't find the words anymore." Annie took the box carefully, understanding the trust he was placing in her hands. "And now I think maybe I could try again, if you'd help." "Always," Annie promised. They sat together on the bed, going through his writings by lamplight. Some were indeed terrible poetry that made them both laugh. Others were profound in their simplicity, observations about the land, the seasons, the way hope could survive even in the hardest ground. "You should keep writing," Annie said. "These are beautiful. Jessie, true things, honest things." "Like you," he said simply. Later, as they prepared for bed, Annie stood before the small mirror, unpinning her hair, in the glass. She saw herself clearly for perhaps the first time, not beautiful like Evelyn. No, but strong, capable, worthy of love not as a second choice, but as the right choice, the only choice. Jessie appeared behind her in the mirror, his hands settling on her shoulders. "What do you see?" "Annie McCready," she said firmly. "A farmer's wife, a woman who belongs here." "The only woman who belongs here," Jessie corrected, pressing a kiss to her hair. The next morning dawned different. The air itself felt changed, carrying a hint of moisture that made every farmer in the county step outside and look up with desperate hope. By midday, clouds were building on the western horizon. Real clouds, heavy and dark with promise. Annie and Jessie stood together in the yard, watching the storm approach, not like that night months ago when they'd saved the calf, but slower, steadier, the kind of rain that soaked deep into the earth instead of running off. "It's coming," Jessie breathed. The first drops fell like benediction, gentle and cool, then more and more, until rain was falling in steady sheets, turning the dust to mud, filling the cracks in the earth. Annie tilted her face up, laughing as water streamed down her cheeks, washing away months of drought and doubt alike. Jessie caught her up, spinning her around in the rain, both of them laughing like children. They were soaked within minutes, but neither cared. The drought was breaking. The land would live. They would thrive. "Look!" Annie gasped, pointing to the garden. Already the plants seemed to be lifting their heads, leaves uncurling toward the life-giving rain. It would take time to recover fully, but the promise was there, green things growing, life returning to the prairie. That night, clean and dry and wrapped in quilts before the fire, Annie penned a letter to her father. She wrote of the race, of the rain, of the farm's salvation, but mostly she wrote of happiness, the deep, quiet kind that came from finding where you belonged. She didn't write to Evelyn. There was nothing left to say to a sister who would never understand that wealth wasn't measured in silk and gold, but in soil and love, and the courage to stay when leaving would be easier. "Read it to me," Jessie requested, and Annie did, feeling no shame in her simple words, her honest heart. When she finished, Jessie drew her close. "Perfect," he said, "like you." Annie smiled, settling into his arms. Outside, the rain continued its blessed fall, promising good harvest come autumn. Inside, two hearts beat as one, having found in each other not what they'd expected, but what they needed, a love as vast as the prairie sky, as enduring as the land itself. She had been led here by her family's desperation, sent as a pale substitute for beauty. But Annie knew now that she'd really been guided by something greater, fate or providence, or simply the mysterious way lives intertwine when they're meant to. She wasn't Evelyn's shadow anymore. She was Jessie's wife, this land's caretaker, her own woman. She was chosen, not as second best, but as exactly right. And that was more than enough. It was everything. As the fire died to embers and Jesse's breathing deepened into sleep, Annie offered up a prayer of gratitude. For the rain, yes, and for the saved farm, but mostly for the journey that had brought her here every difficult step, every moment of doubt, every small victory. She had been meant to be seen, meant to be loved, meant to be chosen forever. And in the end, that's exactly what had happened. Not in spite of who she was, but because of it. The rain sang against the windows, a lullaby of renewal and hope. And Annie McCready, plain and strong and finally home, smiled in the darkness and knew peace. Thank you for listening to this story of love, perseverance, and finding where you truly belong. I'd love to hear where you're enjoying this tale from, whether you're listening during your commute, relaxing at home, or perhaps even somewhere in the wide open spaces that Annie and Jesse called home. Please subscribe to From Wild West channel and share your thoughts about Annie and Jesse's journey. What touched your heart? What made you believe in their love? Your comments mean the world to us, and I can't wait to hear from you all. Until our next story, keep believing in the power of true love and second chances.